This is the introductory education programme for supporters of FRFI. Its structure serves its purpose by establishing the need for organisation in order to meet the crisis of capitalism and fight for socialism. This programme is in no way fixed and is open to suggestions. It remains therefore a work in progress. It is being discussed in open forums across the country where FRFI supporters are active. In section 3 we ask, what is capitalism? Engels stated that the other great discovery of modern scientific socialism was based on Marx's demonstration how the exploitation of the worker by the capitalist takes place. Beginning with an analysis of the simple commodity, Marx was able to lay bare the contradictions at the heart of an economic system which restricted production to the narrow limits of profit-making rather than the needs of society. The theory of surplus value, for the first time, showed how accumulation of wealth at one pole is, at the same time, accumulation of misery, agony, toil, slavery, ignorance, brutality, and mental degradation at the opposite pole. Marxism arms us with a method of seeing beyond the surface phenomena of bourgeois society, to the fundamental yet hidden social processes and relationships of exploitation. And in doing so, Marxism shows how capitalism sows the seeds of its own destruction. This article, 150 Years of Capital, is from issue number 259 of Fight Racism, Fight Imperialism, the newspaper of the Revolutionary Communist Group, published in August 2017. To quote Marx, "Capital is without question the most terrible missile that has yet been hurled at the heads of the bourgeoisie." To quote Engels, "As long as there have been capitalists and workers on earth, no book has appeared which is of as much importance for the workers." To quote Vladimir Mayakovsky, Marx caught the pilferers of surplus value with their pelf red-handed. To quote Che Guevara, "This is the source. Here we learn everything together, in fits and starts, searching what is still barely intuition." To quote Bertolt Brecht, "When I read Marx's Capital, I understood my plays." And to quote Sergei Eisenstein, "It is hard to conceive of any more devastating attack against social democracy in all its aspects than Capital." And to quote Lenin, "It is the greatest work on political economy of our age." The 14th of September 2017 is the 150th anniversary of the publication of the first volume of Marx's life's work, Capital. The truths of this titanic work have been refuted over and over a million times by a gaggle of bourgeois professors since its birth. Yet its conclusions continue to be confirmed decade after decade by crisis-ridden capitalism. Why is Capital so important to the revolutionary socialist movement? Capital is a critique of political economy, according to Marx's subtitle. Why are we talking about political economy at all? Why should we be criticising it? What has it got to do with the practical work of fighting for socialism? Back in 1848, when Marx and Engels were cutting their revolutionary teeth, Europe was burning with revolution. Across the European continent, the then middle class, the bourgeoisie, was rising against the constraints of feudalism. The working class rose with them. Marx was in Germany, editing a new revolutionary newspaper called the Neue Rheinische Zeitung, while Engels was learning infantry tactics and drilling, arms in hand with other German revolutionaries. The 1848 revolutions failed. The bourgeoisie, scared of the power and potential of the rising working class, compromised with the feudalists, and reaction set in. As Marx described it, all the party organisations and party journals of the working classes were, on the continent, crushed by the iron hand of force. The most advanced sons of labour fled in despair to the transatlantic republic, and the short-lived dreams of emancipation vanished before an epoch of industrial fervour, moral marasmus, and political reaction. Marx was banned in Belgium, expelled successively from Germany and then France, ending up in London. Convinced that the movement had been crushed for the time being, Marx settled down in the British Museum to investigate political economy, which he had been studying since the early 1840s. "I have got far enough," he confidently wrote to Engels in 1851, "to finish the whole economic crap in 5 weeks, and when that is finished, I will write out the economy at home and launch myself into another science." As we now know, the whole economic crap took him considerably longer. Capital was published in 1867, and in fact, he never finished it himself. Meanwhile, the working class movement in Britain made some unspectacular but important gains in the Factory Acts, which limited the length of the working day and instituted other protections. When, in 1864, the revival of the working class movement in continental Europe and the strength of the British trade unions combined to found the International Working Men's Association, the IWMA, the first international, Marx described the 10 Hours Bill as the first time that in broad daylight the political economy of the middle class succumbed to the political economy of the working class. What is the political economy of the working class? Marx contrasted the blind rule of the supply and demand laws which form the political economy of the middle class, and the social production controlled by social foresight which forms the political economy of the working class. In other words, the blind workings of the law of value versus the planned economy, of capitalism versus socialism. But it is more than that. The political economy of the working class has a number of facets. One facet is a policy of reforms, such as the restriction of hours, health and safety legislation, the right to a job, unemployment and welfare insurance, the right to organise and to strike, whose promotion expands the power of the working class, and, to a certain extent, asserts the social production controlled by social foresight, as Marx put it, within the capitalist economy. Another facet is its scientific character. Marx did for political economy what Copernicus did for astronomy. The sun appears to circle the earth. In the morning it appears in the east, rises, moving overhead, and then disappears in the west. Contrary to appearances, Copernicus asserted the direct opposite, that the sun does not circle the earth, but that the earth circles the sun. Marx did the same for capitalist economy, insisting, against appearances, that its inner workings were driving it towards crisis. The vulgar economist, Marx's abbreviated term for the political economists of the middle class, had not the faintest idea that the actual everyday exchange relations cannot be directly identical with the magnitudes of value. The vulgar economist thinks he has made a great discovery when, as against the relation of the inner interconnection, he proudly claims that in appearance things look different. In fact, he boasts that he holds fast to appearance, and takes it for the ultimate. Why then have any science at all? Marx rhetorically asked his friend Kugelmann in his famous letter on the 11th of July, 1868. But the matter has another background, Marx explained. He was not interested simply in establishing scientific truths in the abstract. The truth was necessary to fight the bourgeois politics in the workers' movement. Once the interconnection is grasped, all theoretical belief in the permanent necessity of existing conditions collapses before their collapse in practice. Here, therefore, it is absolutely in the interest of the ruling class to perpetuate this senseless confusion. And for what other purpose are the sycophantic babblers paid, who have no other scientific trump to play, save that in political economy one should not think at all? Ending senseless confusion in the movement was the reason Marx developed his critique of political economy. Even before Capital was published, Marx was using his arguments to support workers' struggles. In April 1865, John Weston, a member of the General Council of the First International, was arguing that the amount of wages paid to the worker determined the value of commodities, and that if capitalists increase wages, then they will increase the price of commodities accordingly, leaving the worker no better off. Describing this as inane, Marx wrote to Engels that this was a result of attaching itself only to the most superficial external appearance. Citizen Weston drew the logical conclusion of his theory, based on appearances, and asserted that a general rise in the rate of wages would be of no use to the workers, and that, therefore, the trade unions have a harmful effect. Marx believed that if these ideas were accepted, we should be turned into a joke, both on account of the trade unions here and of the infection of strikes which now prevails on the continent. Accordingly, Marx undertook to criticise Weston's views, and expound for the first time in public his own theories, in 2 lectures to the General Council, which were later published as Wages, Price and Profit. Thus, at a critical juncture, there was at the time a general clamour for the rise of wages. Marx delved into political economy to fight bourgeois politics within the movement. The first part was an answer to Weston's initiates, the second a theoretical dispute. The next year, 1866, Marx collaborated with the revolutionary tailor George Acarius on a series of articles criticising the political economy of John Stuart Mill, the bourgeois liberal socialist who was influential amongst the British trade unionists, the right wing of the IWMA. This is another example of the political economy of the working class. Defenders of capitalism and the ruling class within the movement rely for their politics on quote-unquote common sense, which denies the reality behind appearances and confuses social relations with the properties of things. Thus, racism is seen not as the result of social relations under imperialism, but simply as a psychological problem. Women's oppression becomes a property of gender, not a condition perpetuated by capitalist social relations. The policy of austerity is seen as a choice, as an option, selected thanks to the ill will of capitalists, not as a necessity, forced on them by the crisis tendencies of capital. If it were the former, it could be reformed away. If the latter, reform of capitalism is impossible, and therefore there is no choice but to abolish capitalism entirely. This is something we have seen over and over in the movement. The ruling class and its defenders within the working class did not simply give up when Marx demonstrated the flaws in their theory. They would repeat the same falsehoods to the working class in different garb and redouble their defence of capitalism. It is necessary to assert repeatedly the political economy of the working class against the political economy of the middle class, against vulgar economy. Marx did it in 1865, against Weston's ideas, against John Stuart Mill, at much greater length, in his wholesale assault on capitalism. Already in 1859, he explained how it was directed against petit bourgeois influence in the movement. Quote, "In these first 2 chapters, the basis of Proudhonist socialism, now fashionable in France, will be run into the ground. Communism must above all dispose of this false brother. Even before the German edition was published, he was keen to get a French translation of Capital published swiftly to combat the influence of petit bourgeois socialism in the French workers' movement. Quote, I consider it very important to emancipate the French from the false beliefs in which Proudhon has buried them. In 1875, Marx criticised the German Social Democrats. Social Democrats was the name then given to Marxist parties, for numerous concessions to Lassalleanism, another variety of petit bourgeois socialism, in their unity programme. In his critique of their draft Gotha programme, a thoroughly objectionable programme that demoralised the party, Marx drew up his critique of political economy to refute its numerous errors. It's almost as if there were a law. Every generation has to do this, it seems, to revisit capital in order to assert anew the revolutionary truth about capitalism, to develop revolutionary policy, and to fight anti-working class trends. In the 1890s, in Russia, Lenin had to confront the Narodniks, who argued that capitalism was a foreign importation into Russia, and that socialism should be built natively, based on the peasant commune, and that revolutionaries should go amongst the people, the peasantry. Drawing on Capital, Lenin organised a vast amount of empirical data to show how capitalism was already developing in Russia, and that therefore revolutionaries should base themselves on the working class and work for a socialist revolution. In Germany, in 1898, Edward Bernstein, a prominent member of the Social Democrats, then a Marxist socialist party, argued that anything resembling a simultaneous and total collapse of the present system of production becomes less likely rather than more. Rosa Luxemburg retorted that, if we assume with Bernstein that the development of capitalism is not pushing towards its own downfall, then socialism ceases to be objectively necessary. Socialism would not be necessary to avoid crisis and immiseration, but simply be a subjective choice. The debate raged over these and related issues, especially the question of imperialism, for 2 decades, with contributions from Karl Kautsky, Otto Bauer, and many other prominent Marxists. In 1929, Henrik Grossman, a communist, critiqued the entire debate for its failure to understand and apply Marx's methods from Capital, and insisted that capitalism was heading to a breakdown due to overaccumulation. Capitalism had the final say, when, later that year, it plunged into the Great Depression. In the winter of 1915, even as the Scottish working class was engaged in rent strikes and the struggle against labour dilution and conscription, John Maclean, the great Scottish revolutionary, had a regular attendance of almost 500 workers at his weekly class on Marxian economics in Glasgow. In Soviet Russia, beginning in 1924, a debate raged about industrialization, drawing on categories from Capital. The rate of industrialization, the relationship to the world economy, policy towards agriculture, and the peasantry were the main issues. Yevgeny Preobrazhensky, Lev Shanin, Nikolai Bukharin, Vladimir Bazarov, Stanislav Strumelin, and others debated the best way forward for the Soviet economy. This debate ended abruptly, partly due to academic rivalry and partly due to suppression by the bureaucratized Communist Party. In embattled Cuba in 1963-65, Che Guevara led the great debate on questions of political economy relevant to the struggle to build socialism, followed by his critique of the Soviet Manual of Political Economy. Both drew deeply on categories developed in Capital. This was not an academic debate, but related deeply to the planning and management process, technology, and other questions. In 1971, the tendency that became the RCG was born in a controversy inside the International Socialists, later renamed the Socialist Workers' Party. David Yaffe produced his devastating critique of the IS or SWP, state expenditure, and the Marxian theory of crisis, which destroyed its theory of so-called permanent arms economy. That theory was based in the neo-Ricardian critique of Marx, and abandoned Marx's political economy, leading to their adoption of a basically bourgeois Keynesian analysis of capitalism, which implied that capitalism could avoid economic crisis, which, of course, it didn't. All these were debates over the political economy of the working class. What is it at a given time and place? A political economy of the working class must go behind appearances and develop a theory of the state of capitalism, provide a criticism of the political economy of the middle class, and criticise and expose versions of this inside the movement in order to develop an independent working class policy. Capital is not an easy or brief book, but it contains the tools we must use to defeat our enemies within the working class. So, Just at the point when our enemies are busy clamouring, yet again, that they have refuted Capital, we return to study this remarkable work and use Marx's method to forge anew the weapons of struggle for our time. This article, Basic Principles of Marxism Part 5, The Bloody Origins of Capitalism, is from FRFI issue 90, first published in October 1989. To quote William Stanley Jevons, an economist of rising British capital, from his work The Coal Question, written in 1865, "The plains of North America and Russia are our cornfields. Chicago and Odessa are granaries. Canada and the Baltic are our timber fortresses. Australasia contains our sheep farms, and in Argentina and on the western prairies of North America are our herds of oxen. Peru sends her silver, and the gold of South Africa and Australia flows into London. The Hindus and the Chinese grow our tea for us, and our coffee, sugar and spice plantations are all in the Indies. Spain and France are our vineyards, and the Mediterranean our fruit garden, and our cotton grounds, which for long have occupied the southern United States, are now being extended everywhere in the warm regions of the earth." But in Capital, Karl Marx writes, "While the cotton industry introduced child slavery in England, in the United States it gave the impulse for the transformation of earlier, more or less patriarchal slavery into a system of commercial exploitation. In fact, the veiled slavery of the wage labourers in Europe needed the unqualified slavery of the New World as its pedestal." In his analysis of the origins of capitalism, Marx challenges the elitist and racist assumptions of the bourgeois ideologues. The accumulation of capital presupposes surplus value. Surplus value presupposes capitalist production. Capitalist production presupposes the availability of considerable masses of capital and labour power in the hands of commodity production. From whence, then, comes capital and the mass of labour power? From primitive accumulation. An accumulation which is not the result of capitalist mode of production, but its point of departure. Marx mocked the role given primitive accumulation in capitalist economic theory. It played the same role in political economy as original sin does in theology. One set of people, the European bourgeoisie, was saved by virtue of their economy, and became owners who employed labour power. The other set, other races in the working class, became the workers who sell their labour power. In a free market, the industrious are bound to succeed in any trade, and so it was, according to the bourgeois ideologues, that the European, and in particular the British capitalists, won fair and square. Marx showed that capital, far from emerging out of fair trade, was wrenched into being by violence. Quote, "The historical movement, which changes the producers into wage labourers, appears on the one hand as their emancipation from serfdom and the fetters of the guilds, and is this aspect of the movement that alone exists for our bourgeois historians. But on the other hand, these new freedmen became sellers of themselves, only after they had been robbed of all their own means of production, and this history, the history of their exploitation, is written in the annals of mankind in letters of fire and blood." Such was the birth of capitalism in Europe, but overseas, to quote Karl Marx from Capital, the discovery of gold and silver in America, the extirpation, enslavement and entombment in mines of the indigenous population of that continent, the beginnings of the conquest and plunder of India, and the conversion of Africa into a preserve for the commercial hunting of blackskins are all things which characterise the dawn of the era of capitalist production. These idyllic proceedings are the chief moments of primitive accumulation. Marx also cited Christopher Columbus's letter from Jamaica, dated 1503. "Gold is a wonderful thing. Its owner is a master of all he desires. Gold can even enable souls to enter paradise." It's clear that right from the beginning, Europe's enterprise in the Americas was a matter of capital accumulation. Gold and silver flowed across the Atlantic. In Europe, the circulation of metal coins multiplied up to tenfold during the 16th century. Commodity production increased, and the means to dispose of vast amounts of wage labour grew. Perhaps 3 million American Indians were enslaved by the Spanish in the first half of the 16th century, 400,000 in Nicaragua alone. 90% of the central Mexico's 30 million people were slaughtered or perished from European diseases. Whole peoples were exterminated for gold and silver. Replacements were ordered from Africa. As many as 100 million Africans were captured and traded by Europeans in 300 years. As late as 1800, 1 in 5 died on the Atlantic crossing. Captain John Hawkins was rewarded by Elizabeth I with a ship, the Jesus, and a knighthood for his initiative in launching England into slavery. His coat of arms bore a representation of an African in chains. Plantations supplemented mining profits. Barbados was England's first sugar colony, commencing product iron around 1640. In 50 years, 50,000 slaves were transported to this tiny island. Between 1650 and 1807, approximately 750,000 Africans were brought to Jamaica as slaves. By the end of the 18th century, the Caribbean was transferring capital equivalent to 10% of Britain's entire income back to the mother country. It was precisely the expansion of the world market in sugar and cotton that Marx saw ever worsening the conditions in which the slaves were held. Quote, "But in proportion as the export of cotton became of vital interest to those of southern USA states, the overworking of the Negro and sometimes the consumption of his life in 7 years of labour became a factor in a calculated and calculating system. It was no longer a question of obtaining from him a certain quantity of useful products, but rather of the production of surplus value itself. That surplus value fueled the European bourgeoisie and the Industrial Revolution. James Watt, inventor of the steam engine in 1763, expressed his gratitude to the slave owners who funded his experiments. Barclays Bank and Lloyd's have their origins in the slave trade. Shipping, insurance, banking, industry and agriculture were all stimulated by slavery. Bristol, Liverpool, Nantes, Dieppe, Bordeaux, Marseille, Seville, Boston and New York all grew up and flourished from the proceeds of slavery. Africa was depopulated, its metal and cloth industries destroyed, trade routes abandoned, and people scarred with war and underdevelopment, which is felt down to today. Such was the legacy of the European civilization mongers, as Engels called them. In the opening passages of the Communist Manifesto in 1848, Marx and Engels exhilarated in the revolutionizing powers of the new bourgeoisie. All fixed, fast-frozen relations, with their train of ancient and venerable prejudices and opinions, are swept away. All new-formed ones become antiquated before they can ossify. All that is solid melts into air, all that is holy is profaned, and man is at last compelled to face, with sober senses, his real conditions of life and his relations with his kind. As capitalism raced across the globe, so the cheap prices of its commodities are heavy artillery with which it batters down all Chinese walls. It compels all nations, on pain of extinction, to adopt the bourgeois method of production. Marx and Engels hated the hypocrisy of the bourgeoisie and the violent injustices of their system, but they saw it as a higher form of production and a precondition for the agent of its undoing, the emancipation of humankind, the proletariat. By its very revolutionizing of the means of production, capitalism outlived its need for plantation slavery, and in so doing, strengthened the position of the US working class. The plantation proved too costly and inflexible for capitalism's new productive methods. By the 1830s, slave-grown cotton had amounted to half of US exports. Much of it came to Britain and left for India as cloth. In 1850, India absorbed an eighth of Britain's total exports and a quarter of its cloth. The British textile industry employed an eighth of the workforce and earned a twelfth of national income. Of the British bourgeoisie's interests in India, Marx observed that the aristocracy wanted to conquer it, the moneyocracy to plunder it, and the millocracy to undersell it. The millocracy industrialists sought to have cotton production transferred from the southern US states to India, and transfer the Atlantic trade to wheat from the newly settled prairies of the US Northwest. The campaign for the abolition of the Corn Laws was to this end. By 1849, all of India was conquered. With the abolition of the slave trade in 1833, India also provided a source of cheap, mobile labour, some of which was transferred to plantations in the British colonies Ceylon. When the US Civil War broke out in 1861 between the southern slave plantocracy and the northern states, it was little wonder that the British bourgeoisie divided. In 1838, 50% of the bonds of the cotton states were held in London. Marx and Engels supported the northern states. As Marx writes in Capital, in the United States of America, every independent workers' movement was paralysed as long as slavery disfigured part of the Republic. Labour in a white skin cannot emancipate itself where it is branded in a black skin. However, a new life immediately arose from the death of slavery. The first fruit of the American Civil War was the 8 Hours agitation, which ran from the Atlantic to the Pacific, from New England to California, with the 7-league boots of the locomotive. The Civil War forced up the price of cotton, and shortages occurred. Lancashire textile workers were thrown out of work. Public health surveys remarked upon how improved the workers looked now they could get some fresh air and light, and how edifying it was to see Lancashire girls finding the time to sew. Government-employed doctors were dispatched to estimate the minimum nutrition necessary to ward off starvation. Egyptian cotton exports rose tenfold during the war. India's was soon to follow. From 1856 to 58, British capitalists had fought the Second Opium War against China. Britain and India had a trade deficit with China. In order to pay for imports of tea, silk and silver, the British East India Company promoted opium cultivation in India for export to China. When the Chinese resisted, the economist of the day argued that the export of opium was a right of free trade. Opium revenues, it argued, were necessary to make good the trade imbalance with Australia, gold, and the USA, cotton. Writing in the New York Herald Tribune in 1853, Marx predicted, "It may seem very strange, and a very paradoxical assertion, that the next uprising of the people of Europe, and their next movement for republican freedom and economy of government, may depend more on what is now passing in the Celestial Empire, China, the very opposite of Europe, than on any other political cause that now exists. More even than on the menaces of Russia and the consequent likelihood of a general European war." Marx had traced the global interconnectedness of capital, and the blow he predicted in China reverberated around the world to Europe and the USA. His analysis was a forerunner of Lenin's concept of imperialism and the need to support the oppressed nation's right to self-determination. Again, thank you for listening, and you can go to our website revolutionarycommunist.org or frfi.co.uk for more of our articles, or to get in touch with us to find out about local meetings across the country, or to find out how to get involved with street work and local campaigns.